Alright guys, so welcome to another video, and in this video I'd like to actually talk about just starting up the 172R model. Now just keep in mind I do fly the N model, but there's not too many differences in this model, the R model and the N model. I did finally purchase Bandicam, the full edition. For all you guys that have been telling me to get the full edition, I finally did it. I figured if I'm going to invest time in this channel and just kind of provide general aviation and flight simulator as it relates to general aviation training in the most realistic manner, I might as well just do it. I intend on doing this for years to come. In addition to flight sims, I'll also look at mil sims and just hopefully provide content in the future. So the first thing you want to do, as we're sitting here with the A2A 172R, which is easily the best general aviation aircraft ever created for flight simulator. I'm sure they'll continue that legacy into the next decade. You want to hit Shift 8, and that will bring up your pre-flight inspection. Now I'll just go through what they have. I have a real-life checklist that I use, but let's just go ahead and use what A2A has. It's pretty accurate to what is in the Pilot's Operating Handbook. Alright, so first thing is our cabin check, and the pitted tube cover, you're actually going to remove that outside the aircraft, and that is the pitted tube, for those that don't know, is actually can't see it, but it's that tube right over there. Alright, so if we actually step outside of the aircraft, let's see if we could spot it here. I think the door is kind of covering it here. Let me go ahead and go back in here, and I will close this door. And hopefully you can get a better view of it here. Yeah, so that's it right there. You just want to make sure that that is not obstructed. Usually there's a red cover that goes over it, and you just want to make sure that that's off. So weight and balance, let's go back to Pilot Operating Handbook. That usually is in the glove compartment. Sometimes there it is right there, actually, for us. In that little compartment, usually a lot of people will keep it inside the little glove compartment in there. And weight and balance, you want to check that on the ground. If you're going through a private pilot, you go through how to do weight and balance, and essentially you want to make sure the center of gravity is within limitations, and the aircraft is balancing between the wings and the engine and the weight of the passengers. There is a center of gravity, and if that's the real danger is if it's too far aft, it can actually give you a nose high condition, and if you stall the aircraft, you may not be able to recover. It also gives you an unstable platform to fly upon. So you want to make sure you do that. Parking brake, we'll go ahead and set that. Ignition switch should be off, which it is, and avionics master switch should be off, which you can see it right here. So that is in the off position. Battery master switch, let's go ahead and turn that on, and we'll throw on the PTUT heat, or the pitted heat, right here, just for a second. We'll check the fuel quantity, and this is the exact same check that we do in real life, so we got about 20 gallons in each side, and then you'll go ahead and put the avionics master switch on. We'll make sure the alternative static source is off, and we'll test the annunciator panel, and the way you do that is just click up here and make sure that all your lights are flashing. Make sure that they're working, which they are. And we'll release that. Check appropriate lights remain on. Fuel selector to both, which is down here. We can select either the left wing or the right wing. So we want to make sure it's on both. And fuel shutoff valve should be in, which is this valve right here. Flaps extend, and we'll go ahead and extend full flaps. Make sure that those are operating properly, which it seems like they are. And again, same exact thing that we do in real life to make sure the aircraft flaps are working. You don't have just one flap that goes down and not the other, because that would be pretty bad in flight. Once you do that, you go ahead and turn the pitted heat off, and we'll touch that later to make sure it's hot, make sure that that's working. And we'll turn the avionics master switch off and battery switch to off. We'll set the trim for takeoff here. And the way you know that is see that triangle on the left, you want to make sure that this line, which is where the trim is, lines up at the takeoff trim, which is right there in the center. And if you have passengers in the back, you do want to trim nose down somewhat because the center of gravity would be further aft. Just a little tip for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and go out to the outside of the aircraft, and we'll continue the checklist. Okay, so here we'll actually physically touch this and see that's the cover that I was talking about. We'll physically touch this, and red means it's hot, so that means it's the pitted heat is working. If we were to encounter icing up at altitude, and this were to ice over, we can throw on the pitted heat and that would melt any ice that was in there. Also, if water condensation got in there and blocked this tube, it could also potentially evaporate that water. What the pitted tube does is that it accepts incoming air, and the way to think about it is if you just think of molecules of air kind of jamming into here, they'll jam into here and create pressure in the system, which in turn gives you an airspeed indication. So the faster you're going, the more air molecules entering this tube and the more pressure is entering into this tube. Therefore, the higher your airspeed indication is going to be, and that's basically how your airspeed indicator works. Okay, so moving along here, you want to check that the baggage compartment is locked, and usually we'll just kind of wiggle that around, use the key, and make sure that that is nice and locked, which it is. And looking down the fuselage, you want to make sure that there's no wrinkles on here. Nobody's been over-G'ing the aircraft. Coming back to the empennage section, which is the vertical stabilizer, the horizontal stabilizer, which includes the rudder and elevator. Sometimes, like in a Piper Warrior, you'll have a stabulator, which is an entire horizontal stabilizer plus an elevator that moves all in one. A lot of military aircraft like the F-18 Super Hornet, the F-18 Legacy Hornet, the F-15, they all have what's called stabilators, and this entire piece would move. But if I were to remove this, we just have an elevator that's independent from the horizontal stabilizer, and it will move independently. So, and the rudder will move as well. Alright, so you want to make sure that all tie downs are currently not on, okay, which they're not. And we're going to check a few things on the elevator. You can see here the elevator, and this little wire right here, and in real aircraft, you want to make sure that that's static. It's called a static wire, and it vents any type of electrical energy out of these little things right here. So if the aircraft gets hit by lightning, you'll actually be able to discharge that. But also, in order to prevent the aircraft from being hit by lightning, you actually the aircraft is constantly discharging. When the aircraft flies through the air, it actually rubs against air molecules and it creates friction. That friction will create electric buildup on the aircraft, and so this kind of vents that out into the atmosphere, back out into the atmosphere. You want to make sure there's a bolt and nut here, as well as this rod is operating, and nut and bolt here, and another static wire on the other end as well. So these are the two elevator sections, and then you actually want to move the elevator to make sure that it is working, and that's what we're doing right now. Okay. In the tail section, you'll actually see, if you move the rudder, you'll actually see a rod here, a nut and bolt there, and you'll actually see wires underneath as well. So I don't know if you can see that, but there's actually wires that go right here on the rudder, and those are the wires that control the rudder. So in real life, you'd actually move those to make sure that they are operating correctly. So moving on to the other side, we'll check the wing flap, and what you do is you actually move it to make sure that it's not stuck. So freedom of movement. If this flap were unable to move, you would know that it either wasn't greased up or it was jammed in place by overspeeding and deploying the flaps at overspeed. Okay, underneath the flap, this is looking underneath the flap. If you were standing underneath the wing, you actually have these rods here, these sliders, and these are called Fowler flaps because they actually extend the wing. Actually, I might be wrong about that. Fowler flaps will be found in like a 737, 757 type of setup. This actually might extend and actually go down, so it might be constituted as a Fowler flap. But you want to make sure that those rollers are clear, and again, just freedom of movement of the actual wing itself. Coming back around to the outer wing, we want to check these navigational lights, and I usually check underneath the aileron to make sure that we have proper rods. Here's underneath the aileron, right here. And you want to make sure that you have this wire, or sometimes it's a rod, going all the way through, as well as 4 nuts and bolts across. And you have 3 sections, 1, 2, and 3 of those. You want to make sure those are good. Coming to the front of the wing, usually check just the make sure there's no dents or anything, and check the strut to make sure that that is nice and sturdy. And around this time is when I'll check the landing gear. And landing gear, you just want to make sure that there's no hydraulic fluid. Hydraulic fluid in an aircraft is actually red, and there's also a pin, if you can see it right there, that goes through here and then it splits at the bottom. You might have a little hub cap on here. Some aircraft don't have that. And here's the actual bolt that keeps the wheel in place. General just kind of condition of the tire, you want to make sure that there's no significant scuff marks or wear and tear. Obviously kick the tire or just feel it to make sure that it has proper inflation. And then on the other side you can see the brakes there. On both tires you want to check the disc, and you can actually see if it's being worn out too thin. So that's something you might want to approach a mechanic about if that's the case. Coming to the front of the wing, we'll check the air vents here and make sure there's no obstructions like bird nest or wasp nest or anything weird like that. And then you can actually climb up to the top of the wing and you can actually check. In real life we actually remove the fuel cap and we use a dipstick to check exactly how much fuel we have. So right now we have 22 gallons. Cessna fuel gauges are notorious for not being accurate. In fact, you might get an indication of 0 after a while. The gauges are not to be relied on for accuracy, and it even states that in the, from what I remember, the pilot's operating handbook. So you should always check, no matter what aircraft you fly, make sure that you're physically checking how much fuel is in the actual tank, and then that's what you use to make your flight calculations. If those gauges are wrong and they're overestimating the amount of fuel that you have, you don't want to go on a flight and run out of fuel. And it's a very common thing that happens to pilots, unfortunately. Here you'll check the oil, and right now it looks like we're about 7 quarts, which is plenty. Typically the lowest you want to go is a minimum of 4, but most people would recommend 5 for absolute minimum. And if you're going on a cross country, my flight school recommended 6 always. Also in here, you can't see it, there's actually a lever, not a lever, but kind of a pull that you can pull. It's hard to describe, but fuel will actually come out of the bottom of the aircraft and will spill on the tarmac here. And that's, if you see any bubbles, that means that there is water potentially in the fuel. Coming over to the front, you check the front tire, same thing, proper inflation, wear and tear on the tire. You want to make sure that this is extended, and that this is called a shimmy here. And it prevents the nose wheel from violently rocking left and right. So it just basically is a hydraulic, and if this thing was broken, which I've flown an aircraft when it's broken, the nose wheel will violently kind of go left and right. I mean, you can still control the aircraft, but it's not pleasant. So that makes sure that it's called a damper, or a yaw, not a yaw damper, but a shimmy damper, something like that. This strut here is filled by nitrogen, from my understanding, and so if If you don't see any silver here, that means that your nose wheel compression of this hydraulic is shot. So the nose is not going to have any type of cushioning or shock absorption. On here you have a pin here, typically, or a cover, and you just want to make sure that this is properly inflated. Coming across the front, in here it's very common for birds to want to nest, and you do want to check to make sure there's nothing like that if the aircraft has been sitting, or even if a bird decided to that morning start building a nest and throw some stuff in there. It's a nice kind of cozy spot for creatures. The other thing is you can't see it here, but there's an alternator belt that runs on the right side of the propeller hub, and you want to feel that for tension, make sure that the alternator is working properly, or generator, depending on what aircraft you have. And then down here, you do want to check. Some aircraft have landing light. Mine does. Most newer Cessnas have it refitted to the left wing there. But you do want to check the filter, the air filter here, and make sure that there's nothing obstructing that, because you can have engine overheating problems potentially if that is obstructed. You do have cooling coming in through here, but that is the filter for the engine as well. So here's the static port vent, and that controls your altimeter as well as your vertical airspeed indicator. If this is blocked, you won't have those indications, and that's why you have the alternative static air. You want to be careful not to really touch this too much. You don't want to get dirt in there or anything, but just make sure a bug hasn't made its home in there, and hopefully you'll have good indications on your instruments. So coming up here, same thing. You want to check the fuel, and you throw the dipstick in there. Looks like we have, again, about 22 gallons. Coming up at the front here, you've already checked the pit tube for heat, but you want to make sure that there's nothing obstructing in there. And if you can see, there's a little hole right back here, and that's a fuel vent. So we're actually going to drain, or fuel drain, excuse me. This is actually the fuel vent here, and that if it's too hot, or if the tanks have been overfilled, it'll actually leak fuel from this little vent right here. So what we're looking for is when we drain fuel from this drain, we want to make sure that there's no bubbles inside the fuel. And we use 100 low lead, which is blue in color. We can also use 100, which is green, but typically that's not used anymore. You want to make sure there's no bubbles in here, because that indicates that there's water. Now, if you do find water in the fuel, you just want to keep draining until any bubbles are gone. And typically the water will settle to the bottom of the tank if it's allowed to sit for a while, and you'll be able to drain all that water out. If you don't do that and there's water in the tank, that water will make its way to the engine, and the engine will actually run rough, and you could potentially face an engine failure mid-flight because the engine is starved for fuel. So you definitely want to check that. Coming across to this side, this is actually one of the first things I check when I get out from the initial checklist, and I'll usually check this tire first, but the way this is set up, typically it's last. So same thing as we did on the other side, make sure that pin is in there and proper tire inflation. Same thing on the front. You do want to check, this is that fuel vent that we were talking about, that will vent out extra fuel, especially if it's hot. And here's a stall warning horn, and you want to make sure that there's nothing in there. Again, some of these things, only apply to real life. You probably won't find anything, but actually A2A, let's see, they do have a check for that. So I guess if you click on that, if there's something in there, it'll give you some sort of warning, and you want to make sure that that hole is clear as well, that fuel vent. And it tells you, it kind of explains that up here. Okay, going across the right wing, you want to make sure that this is not broken, that your nav lights are working. And you want to check underneath the aileron. You actually physically hold that up with your hand, and you'll make sure that there's 4 bolts and the rod's running all the way through. Same thing with 1, 2, and 3. So there's 3 positions where it's holding that aileron in place as a safety measure. Again, coming across to the left flap, you want to shake that, make sure that it has freedom of movement, and make sure those rollers are clear. And I tend to twist this little rod right here. That's what actually pushes the flap out, and you just want to make sure that it's not stuck and you have freedom of movement. And we're back to where we started. So we actually come back to the front of the aircraft. Okay, so as we continue this procedure, I'll be using the end model checklist. It's a little bit different, but there's a little bit of variations for the R model. Okay, so the before starting checklist, basically you want to complete the pre-flight inspection, which we just did. Establish the pilot in command. So if you have two pilots in here, usually it's the most experienced one, or whoever decides that they're actually going to be making the final decisions in the flight. Passenger briefing. If you have any passengers, you want to tell them to go ahead and buckle their seat belts and make sure that their seats are nice and locked. And we'll check the fuel selector valve is on both, which it is. Avionics should be off, which they are. Circuit breakers should be in, and just check the circuit breakers, make sure that none of them are popped out. Transponders should be on standby, which our electrical system is off here. And in our transponder that we have, it actually has a standby. Oh, here it is right here. So there's a standby indication, so it can be off or on standby. So we'll just keep it on standby here. And starting the engine, you're going to yell clear prop outside of the window, and you're going to yell that to make sure that everyone hears that you're starting the aircraft. And then you want to visually check to make sure that there's nobody around. But usually I get everything set up before I actually yell that out. So I go mixture full rich, which is, there's the mixture. Throttle open 1/8 of an inch. Okay, and just a tiny bit. Carburetor should be cold. This is not a carbureted engine; it's fuel injected, so that doesn't apply. But in a lot of the Skyhawks flying out there are still carbureted, so you do want to make sure the carburetor heat is in, and that's usually like right around here. You just push it in. That means it's cold. Primer, we don't have primer in this aircraft. If you did, it would be on the left side of the ignition, and we would just give it like four or 6 shots. You know, if it was cold, or excuse me, two shots if it's cold. If it's really cold, 4 or 6 shots, or even more. And then if the engine is hot, you don't really need to prime it at all. But for this, we're actually going to use the fuel pump. So I'll go ahead and turn the master on, and I'll turn the fuel pump on. And you'll get some fuel flow. And we'll just do that for just a few seconds, and we'll turn it off. So what that does is it gets fuel in the cylinders. Instead of having a manual prime it, you use the pump. And forgive me if I'm getting some stuff wrong about the R model. Brakes set. So typically we'll just hold the brakes, and you can see the brakes right down there. We'll just hold those, make sure that the aircraft doesn't roll forward. We'll turn the rotating beacon on. A lot of people just keep the beacon on all the time. And I'll turn the master switch on, which it is. And we'll part of your pre-flight, you'll actually check to make sure that beacon is working, which it is, and that just tells people that you're going to start the aircraft. Now in daytime it's not really as important because people can't see that too well. I mean, pilots will know to look for that, but typically, you know, people might kind of catch a glimpse at it. It's more important like during dusk or dawn or nighttime operations, but nonetheless it's still good to have some indicator that you're going to start the aircraft. Military aircraft will do that as well. They'll turn the lights on before they actually start. Just lets people know that there's activity going on with the aircraft. So then you go ignition to start. So at this point I like to just yell out the window, prop clear, and of course you'll yell pretty loudly, and you want to visually make sure that there's no persons around the propeller. At that point you get your left hand on the ignition, right hand on the throttle, and you will go to start. And sometimes you don't always get a start, so let's try it again. Alright, there we go. So as soon as you start the engine, you want to make sure that first thing you check is the oil pressure, and make sure that that's coming up. If you have no oil pressure, you should turn the engine off probably within 30 seconds or less. So there's no oil pressure in there, there's no oil in the engine, and you could seize up the engine really quickly. The other thing you want to look for is make sure the battery is charging, which is in the positive. If it's in the negative, that means it's actually discharging. So you want to make sure the battery is charging back because it was discharged during the start. So the alternator generator is recharging the battery. And then of course you have fuel flow, and your temperature will slowly creep up depending on the outside temperature and things like that. And you're going to set the throttle between 800 and 1000 RPM. You don't want to go too low because that'll actually foul up the spark plugs and starve the engine of fuel. You want to make sure you give it some RPM so you can, keep that belt spinning. Make sure you're charging up the battery, and as well as keeping the engine nice and warm. And after that, we're going to lean the mixture just a little bit so we don't over fuel the engine, and we will remember to put the mixture back up before we take off. And then the last thing you want to do is go ahead and raise the flaps. Okay, we'll throw the avionics on, which they are on already, and we'll listen to the weather. Once we listen to the weather, we can decide whether we want to go. The next thing is a before taxi takeoff. So hopefully I'll be doing more of these videos, and the next video that I do regarding this FSX private pilot training will be a taxi and takeoff, normal takeoff tutorial. So hopefully I'll see you guys next time.